everyone. Welcome to the Zone to Speak podcast. I'm your host, Juliana. This episode of Zone to Speak is supported by Peloton, the ultimate sunscreen for athletes. If you know me, you know I never leave the house without sunscreen, and Peloton is my go-to. It's lightweight, breathable, and designed for endurance sports, perfect for any day out on the saddle. And because they are supporting the podcast, you get 20% off your order. Just head to the link in the show notes and use the code ZONE2SPEAK at checkout. Protect your skin, fuel your adventures, and support the pod while you do it. All right, today on Zone to Speak, we are talking about engineering, but not that kind that stays locked inside a lab, because my guest is someone who has spent the last decade trying to solve one very specific problem. Why does riding a bike have to hurt? My guest is Erik de Brun, the co-founder and principal engineer of Redshift Sports, the company behind products like the shock stop stem and seat post that have quietly become almost cult favorites in gravel, endurance, and ultracycling. What's interesting about Erik is that he didn't come from the cycling industry. Before Redshift, he worked on everything from military aircraft to landmine clearance equipment. Then somehow that turned into designing bike components that helped people ride longer, further, and with less pain. If your hands were numb, your neck hurt, your back was destroyed, that was almost a badge of honor. But now, riders are starting to ask different questions. Can bikes actually be comfortable? Can performance and comfort exist together? So today we're talking about the engineering mindset behind Redshift. Let's get into it. Erik, welcome to the pod.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. So Redshift started with engineers who were also cyclists, not industry marketing people. How did Redshift actually begin, and what problem were you trying to solve first?
Yeah, we did come from outside the industry. We were obviously super into bikes. That was a given, and we were all endurance athletes. And
Cool.
so we had another company, actually, my co-founders and I, where we were doing engineering work for other brands outside the cycling industry. And we had been part of a couple successful product launches, and sort of saw it from the inside and thought, well, that was really interesting. But we didn't get to do the other pieces. We were really just focused on the engineering. And the idea kind of came up of, maybe we could do our own product. We could try to launch a company. And it was very, informal. And so we just went about doing it. And that was in 2013. And back in 2013, crowdfunding was actually like very new and very exciting. And so it was, it didn't really have any of the baggage that it has today. And so, there was lots of really cool stuff being launched actually on crowdfunding. So we designed a product, put it out on crowdfunding, had a modest, yet we viewed it as very successful, kind of launch. And that really is what created the company. But it was, it was not just about, oh, we have this really passionate thing we need to fix in cycling. It was more, we thought, wow, it would be really amazing if we could take the engineering background that we have and design products in something that we really love. So it was kind of a coming together. I think we found our voice pretty quickly, but it was a little bit more of this idea of like, hey, this would be a really interesting, thing to work on. And then it sort of turned into a real brand from there.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, because you worked in some pretty intense engineering projects before cycling, like landmine equipment. So how does someone go from designing military to suspension stems for gravel?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So we had this consulting company, and we did all kinds of engineering. And generally, the engineering work we did was extremely rigorous and highly regulated types of environments. So we worked on medical devices. We worked on, like you mentioned, landmine clearance type of stuff. We worked on, large systems for nuclear power plants, things like that. And that does not naturally match up with cycling components, but in reality, the engineering required to work on products in such a rigorous environment is actually the perfect training ground to work on, something that is very close to a person that, needs to be really safe. So when you think about components on a bike, you want to have a lot of faith that your seat post and your stem and your handlebars are going to, perform the way you expect them to. And obviously, there are incidents that happen in cycling. So I think our background is actually really excellent from that standpoint because we know how to look at problems maybe
Yeah.
from a different way, and kind of
Yeah.
understand how to apply some of that rigor into an industry that has been around for a long time, has a lot of rule of thumb in it, but maybe starting more to develop more of an engineering approach over the last maybe 20 years or so. So I think we're excited to be kind of part of that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in any industry, it's always good to have someone that, of course, match some of the skills, but doesn't come from that industry just because it's fresh blood. It's different way of thinking. It challenges in a different way that can create solutions. So, and you guys, did that. And I think sometimes cycling can be also strangely conservative. Like, did you guys feel any resistance early on when introducing the products like the shock stop stem?
Definitely. And I think it is your earlier points really really well made because there's a ton of long time held knowledge, especially at the manufacturers. And that's because in cycling, when you touch a performance piece of equipment, this is changing maybe a little bit these days, but everything came out of Taiwan, and there are a handful of factories there that had this just long expertise in making cycling components. And they had all of that rule of thumb knowledge. They had all of that earned experience. And so I think it was really valuable to actually come in and challenge some of the assumptions, but have them be able to tell us this is actually how we do something, and here's why this really matters. Here's why it works. Here's the 50 years of data we have that backs this up. And so I think for us, that was super interesting to kind of meld that together. But, so while on the manufacturing side, we didn't hit resistance, it was actually really a nice coming together of different expertise. On the industry side, of course, we hit friction. I mean, like you said, it's a very traditional industry. I mean, both in Europe, the UK, and the United States, North America. Maybe less so in North America, but still, I think people have a traditional mindset. And part of that stems, I think, from the idea that cycling sort of culminates in this pro racing piece. And I think that we're
Yeah.
always attached to that. And so,
Yeah.
for better or for worse, that I think defines some of the tradition, right? That defines some of the style that does feed down into things. So we did encounter resistance. I think we were doing things that were probably considered very niche. And I think everyone has seen some video that comes across on Instagram of some crazy cycling contraption. And so, I think that people are dismissive of that kind of thing, sometimes for good reason, right? I mean, sometimes this stuff is just, kind of silly. But I think in other instances, people are a little bit nervous about change, about upending kind of what they view as the traditional mindset. So it did take, I would say it took years before we found that there was, maybe an industry acceptance. And I think that's important. But part of it, I think, is twofold. One is people don't necessarily love change until they get a chance to really understand it and see it and feel it. And I think at the same time, too, there's skepticism that new brands will stick around. So it's a little bit like, is this friend who, moved to my street, are they going to move away in a couple of years?
Yeah.
So do I really
Yeah.
want to invest all of this time? So I think once you show that you're sticking around and people get a chance to use your products, then I think that it's very warm and very accepting and very collaborative within the industry.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned something too about, the changing. I didn't think about what you said in the industry always have these mindsets thinking about the pros and the peloton. And because I wanted to ask you, like, it feels, maybe that's why it feels sometimes almost taboo to think cycling can be comfortable. We can find comfort in cycling. Um, why do you think cyclists have this historically resistance to?
I think it's an endurance athlete mindset, actually. And so my wife is a big marathon runner, so I've done my fair share of running over the years. And I think running and cycling and any other sort of extreme endurance activities, swimming. I think grouping all of these things together, and obviously when you bring those three things together, I mean that's a triathlon too. And so I think that you take these endurance athletes, triathletes may actually be the best example of this because I think that a triathlete mindset is always twofold, right? It's the mindset of what is the optimal equipment that I can use? And there's a massive search for equipment there. But at the same time, I think it's this idea and acceptance that abuse of my body potentially equals performance gain. And I think that, that's both
Yes.
in a training standpoint and in a competition standpoint. And I think that just comes from, a mindset from before. But like you mentioned earlier, I think that mindset has actually started to change significantly
Yeah.
in the
Agree.
last few years. And I think it's probably because we're just getting smarter and smarter about how we train. And the idea of draining ourselves every time we go and train, it's now the data supports that that's really a terrible idea to do that. And I think the same thing may be true. We're understanding in competition that this idea that you can't just run on empty continuously, right? You have to be very careful about nutrition. You have to treat your body kind of as this, a chemical factory that's doing, that's creating energy and putting it out. And I think that mindset though is still hard to shed because we still get in situations where I think sometimes we think that we're just generating energy and work, but sometimes that work is actually sort of coupled with discomfort. And so a good example I like to give actually is time trial positions. I think if you look at the history of a time trial position and you go back to a time trial, let's say in one of the Grand Tours, maybe 20 years ago, or a triathlon, like an athlete, maybe 15 to 20 years ago, you'll see a pro athlete or an elite athlete assume such a flexible position on their bike. Everything was about getting the body as close to the front wheel as possible. Everything is super tight, and aerodynamics was obviously being recognized as this really critical thing. And that's true. But I think
Yes.
the piece that was being missed was that those positions can maybe be assumed by a handful of people who can actually generate power in that position over time. Because
Yes.
even at that time, we were using like a wind tunnel, let's say. You can go in a wind tunnel. I can assume that position in a wind tunnel for 5 minutes, and
Yep.
that's not a problem for me. But, as soon as I hit 20 minutes, I'm going to just start falling off the bike. And so I think that there wasn't maybe a recognition of those two things coming together. And it was kind of papered over because you would put an elite athlete in that position and they could do it. So it would look like they were getting performance enhancements. It looked like they were getting gains, but what they were actually doing was they were probably stifling their ability to generate, actual peak, powers that would last. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, and the other thing is duration, right? You do a 45-minute time trial is very different than going and doing a 6 hour 20 hour, that type of an event. And so there's a wide spectrum, I think, as well, where the longer you go, the much more amplified all of these things become. But I think what we can see is if you look at those comparisons of a time trial position, say from this 15 years ago to now, a rider, even in the absolute elite, time trialists, they're going to be extremely high up on the bike all of a sudden. And it's two things going on.
Yeah.
One thing is the aerodynamics have been studied more, and we've come to recognize that there's a lot more to it than just making your body as small as possible. There's a lot of other factors going on, but it also couples with those positions allow the athlete to generate more consistent, power output because they're just not uncomfortable. They're not closing down natural angles on their body. So I think you kind of combine much more awareness of bike fit, much more awareness of some of the nuances of aerodynamics, and then this idea that, if you put your body into a position where you can't generate power effectively, that's something that is very noticeable. And so to me, I think what's nice is today there's a lot more recognition that what I would call like a typical cyclist's problems, the things we might see with, with the wide spectrum of riders, is actually very equivalent to the same, problems and issues that an elite rider is overcoming. And so, whereas, I was thinking
Yeah.
about our conversation, I was thinking that one of the big things that people often, uh, I think, sort of automatically assume is that I'm very different than that elite rider. So I might
Yeah.
aspire to be just like that elite rider because that's going to give me my most benefit. But ultimately, each of us have this sort of ceiling that we can reach, but our problems are really the same. And so I think this idea that there's this huge gulf between us is maybe true from the standpoint of certain things, VO2 maxes or flexibility or something, but it doesn't mean that we're not actually facing the same types of issues. So I think that for a long time, there was this thought that everyone should use the gear that's right for an elite rider. Then all of a sudden, there was a thought of like, well, that actually isn't a good idea. But I think today, what I like to tell people is that it actually does make sense, but the elite rider should be using stuff that's more fit for a typical rider. And so I think that's really the difference in the mindset shift that I like to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, no, it makes total sense. I think there's the cycling culture that treats comfort and speed are opposites. It is starting to change, like you said, and also you can see it in gravel as well with the tires. Right now, bigger tires are faster, for example, and because also they're also more comfortable. And for me, just a average rider, I do long distance, so for me comfort is speed, because if I'm starting to have a lot of pain, I won't be able to keep going. So yeah, maybe I'm not fast, but I do need to be comfort. So and also I agree, there's a lot of things that the elite rider does that has to be taken into consideration for the average cyclist, right? Like maybe yes, there are specs that you can do, but there are other specs that it wasn't made for you, it was made for this type of elite rider. From an engineering perspective, do you think it's actually true that comfort can make people faster?
I think 100% true. And there's a lot underneath that. And you mentioned off road. I mean, as soon as you go off road, you introduce all of these other factors,
Yes.
that have a additionally sort of huge impact. So now all of a sudden you go from, kind of this idea of the perfect tarmac is almost like a laboratory, right? So you go
Yeah.
from that kind of thing where you're dealing with forces of aerodynamics and wind and, and the rider's body, and you do have effects coming from the road through the bike, and it's real. But as soon as you go off road, all of those bike effects become super amplified. And so I think one thing that people probably, are starting to recognize a lot more now, and it's something that I don't know if I'm not I wouldn't say that we, discovered that this was some grand issue. I think it just kind of came along with what we were designing, where it became very obvious that the effects from the road to the bike, where the road is not perfect, is a pretty significant thing. And it's actually something that most riders can feel, and they may not be able to identify what it is. And so I think what happens is there is a lot of vibration at many, many different frequencies that come through the bike to the rider. And it is all based on the whole system. So it's, what's going on with the road, what's going on with the tires, how the frame is made up, the components that, you touch on the bike and the things that you touch between them. And so, I mean, going back, right, your typical cyclist would have padded gloves on their road bike, right? We used to have tape that was a lot thicker, actually. And so
Yeah.
those were all solutions that were put in place because this was a noticed effect by riders. And I think we actually got away from some of that because there was this thought that using more advanced materials for bike frames was taking care of this problem. Or, elite riders don't do it. So why, they don't have any tape on their bar. Why would you put tape on your bar? And, so I think that some of those things, and then things like we talked about style. I mean, wearing gloves is maybe not as style oriented as it used to be. Used to be the thing you would do, right? And now it's a lot less of a thing you see on a performance road bike, for instance.
Yeah.
So I think people, that hasn't changed. Our mindset changed a little bit, but I do think there's more recognition now that all of these different frequencies, not just the big bumps that you feel when you run over a rock or a root, but the actual, all these underlying frequencies, they're destroying your ability to, fatigue less quickly. So these things are adding to so you're sitting there, you're putting out all this wattage, right? You're fueling yourself, you're trying to be as efficient as possible. And then this bike is beating you up and it's just sucking away your ability to put out wattage. And it's making you more and more and more tired because all of the little muscles on your body are working to combat all of this. So you're a huge
Yeah.
suspension system for yourself. And I think that, some people, they get actual significant effects. Like they'll go do an ultra and their hands will get numb and it'll be numb for days after. And that's actually a really bad thing. You really don't want that to
Yeah.
happen to you because it can cause some pretty significant nerve damage. And so I
Yeah.
think the ultras maybe are opening up this idea of some of the more significant things that can happen. But even just a 1 day, 5 hour, 6 hour race, someone goes out and does that race, they might really feel it, or even just a ride they're doing for fun. And they might not be able to ride the next day, or they might feel something. Once you start actually feeling it like that, I think the recognition is, wow, this has been happening the whole time. It's not that something's changed. It's not like the bike is worse. I'm just receiving this in a different way. And now I'm actually feeling the effect. So that's been happening. And I think that, I feel pretty strongly that we should be doing a lot to get rid of that, because I think that's one of these huge factors that's hurting performance. So when you think about you could be in your best shape of your life, you could have the perfect fuel plan, but then if you just go out there and get beat up and you just get tired faster, well, it's
Game
gonna it's
over.
gonna ruin that performance. So I think
Yeah.
that this idea of thinking about it the same way we think about preparing our body and preparing our nutrition, I think we should be thinking about preparing the bike in the same way, so that when you get on it, you actually can perform the best. And I think that the fatigue aspect is a big thing it's hard to detect if you don't actually get the after effects. Because I might say, oh, you're tired at the end of that gravel race. Of course you are, but you're 20% more tired than you would have been if you actually, were a bit more comfortable on the bike, where the fit was better, for instance, or you were loading your skeletal system and not your small muscles. So I think that, that's a really long-winded way of saying that performance and comfort are completely linked together, just based on this idea of fatigue. And then there's a lot of other things there too. Another layer that I think is really important that is a little bit overlooked is that, when you have a bike that's comfortable, where you can soak up some of the, the off-road and the sort of gnarliness of where you are, you actually uh, maintain sort of the nominal seated position for a lot longer duration.
Yeah.
And, I think anyone who's ridden off road recognizes that, you just instinctually stand up. You instinctually do it. And when you stand up, you're all of a sudden, you're changing the way you're loading your muscles. You're working big muscles all of a sudden in a different way. And, you do that a bunch of times. And that's, you're no longer putting any power down during those moments in time. So this idea of being able to ride less defensively, I think, is also a huge performance gain that is very hard to detect, because it's not like we're going on a running experiment where someone does some loop and then you stand up or sit down. But if you did that, you would really notice a pretty significant difference, actually.
Yeah, well, I agree. And now I'm backed by an engineer, so I'm very happy. I'm always looking for comfort. Um, a lot of bike tech feels designed for elite racers, not normal people. And I feel Redshift does also design for normal people. Who do you actually design products for?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that it's fun. It's funny that it's funny. It's an interesting topic, right? And I think you're right. I think that we have endurance sports in general are aspirational, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that can be super exciting, because a model that one looks towards, can help someone achieve their absolute best. And there's a lot of amazing things that can come from that. So I think without this elite, group that's doing these really interesting, amazing things, I mean, you think it changes the way you might set your goals, and it's nice to
Yeah.
have that. But you're absolutely right that I think, because it's aspirational, a lot of attention is given to products, particularly bikes that are clearly designed for, this is the new bike that's going to be used in this tour, or this is the new bike for this team. And so I think that that's a very clear thing that's always been that way. I think it is changing a little bit. I think we're probably part of that. But yeah, so it's kind of funny to say, oh, well, we design, bikes for a typical rider, or components for a typical rider. Almost all of the people that ride bikes are typical. And it's a very,
Yeah.
very tiny, tiny, tiny group that's actually on the elite side of things. And so it's such a funny idea that in an industry where we're actually making products that people will get, that the focus isn't entirely on the typical rider, because it should be. And so,
Yeah.
it's not entirely fair to say that. There's classes of bikes, obviously, that are much more geared
Yeah.
towards, doing
Yeah.
commuting, or, kids that are trying to, learn to ride bikes and things. But I think when you think about performance oriented riding, of which any typical rider, I think, should be able to call themselves a rider that's seeking performance. If you're
Yes.
thinking about reaching some point, you're, in my mind, a performance rider. It doesn't matter if you're heavier than you want to be, if you're not as fit as you want to be. It doesn't matter. You can still be a performance oriented rider. And so, yes, I think we like to look at components and say these are performance oriented components that are for all riders. And what's nice about it is the pieces that we make generally, they do just as much for an elite as they do for a typical rider. Because, like I said before, we have the same, needs ultimately. We may be able to do different things with the equipment, but we have the same needs. And so the performance gains are real for both groups. And sometimes a typical rider might find huge performance gains from these things because they've actually been subjecting themselves to a really bad situation. But an elite rider, it's the same way. Unlocking extra power, it goes a really long way when you're at the types of peak powers that, these athletes are reaching. So a little bit of gain for them is a huge, piece. Whereas a little bit of gain for a typical rider, it may be a benefit in a different way and not so much like unlocking extra power. So ultimately, I think that we design components that work for everybody, and you get this combination. I don't like to say that we design a component for comfort, because I think comfort probably gets associated with like big saddles and springs and things like that. And ultimately, I think that we're designing performance oriented equipment that does things like eliminates these different frequencies and vibration, allows you to maintain seated position through rough terrain, reduces overall fatigue, makes you also actually more comfortable, which is just more enjoyable, right? And so being happy and having fun is absolutely tied to performance as well. So I kind of think that comfort can have a negative connotation. I don't know what the right word is, but
Yeah,
I like to talk about it
that's
this
what
way.
I said, right? It feels like performance and comfort are opposites of the spectrum, and it shouldn't be, because they
Mhm.
do go together. But you're right, it does have negative connotation, but
I
it
think we've
does
seen
have,
a big
it
change
doesn't
in.
bring performance, but it should.
Yeah, and a good example I like to think about is running shoes. I mean, think about the revolution in running shoes that's happened,
Yeah.
in the past few
Major, the
years.
big soles, nobody would think about it.
Exactly. And I think that when you use those kind of shoes, you think, wow, these are more comfortable than the shoes I used to
Yeah.
run with. And so I think hopefully that is kind of introducing this idea that, there's just massive amounts of evidence now that shows that these are major performance enhancers, and they also make it more enjoyable to run in, at the same time. So I think cycling, is maybe not embracing that in the same way across the board, but there is a change. I mean, I think you mentioned with the bigger tires, and I think that in gravel in particular, right, there is a very nice openness to trying different things and having a lot of different versions of that, right? So there are very race oriented gravel bikes that are, they're very much oriented towards aerodynamics, but they still have pretty big tires. And then there are, bike packing type of gravel bikes that are oriented towards, carrying gear and being comfortable and being able to be, in places that the bike just has to stand up to all these elements. And then there's everything in between. And so I think that's really nice about gravel is that, when we started making components, gravel wasn't really a discipline. And so I think we grew as gravel became a thing, and it was a natural fit because in that type of riding, I think so many of the things that our products, do is accentuated. And so it was a very natural fit because it was so obvious what was happening there, even though
Yeah.
they're really important for all these other types of disciplines as well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it felt like Redshift, gravel, and ultra and bike packing arrived perfect at the perfect moment and exploded together. So very good timing.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say that we had anything to do with that. It was just great timing. So.
Yeah. How about the engineering process? We people see the final product, but not the years of prototypes and failures and weird ideas. What does the development process actually look like at Redshift?
That's a great question. So I do know that it is quite varied across how different people do this type of work. We have a process that we use, which it's going to sound extremely um, low tech, but we are very, very um, oriented towards the writing itself. So I think that you can develop products sort of marketing first. I think you can think about, cars are a good example, right? You can think about what's the next model year and how do we find a feature to allow us to iterate on something. And that's not our mindset at all. We are not chasing new versions of things every year. Obviously, that's quite a bit of excess type of stuff. I mean, once you make something that's really good, it should stand up for a while. So we are generally, all our ideas come from you know just our own riding, but not exclusively. I mean, we have quite a few people that ride with our products now, and we observe people riding all the time, different disciplines coming up. I mean, so we're very aware of what's going on, and we tend to pick out what I would call unmet needs that are not being necessarily, they're not obvious. That's probably the way we like to do things the most, is to see some of these, a problem is maybe the wrong word sometimes, but problem, issue, need that hasn't been addressed because everyone just accepts that is something that we should do. And I think those are some of the most fruitful areas. So there's a lot of those. And so we're constantly, kind of discovering some of those things. And then it starts with just a conversation, honestly, internally. So we've got both engineers and non-engineers that we're frequently just meeting and talking about, things that are happening or something that happened on a ride, something we saw somewhere, piece of feedback we got from somebody. Customers will send us their bike builds, and so we'll see something really interesting on that you haven't thought about before. So that's where the ideas sort of get generated, and then they honestly get kind of sort of discussed a little bit in a really open and lightweight way, not necessarily some formal brainstorming or anything. And then you can kind of tell when people think, oh, there's something here. And as soon as you feel like there's something there, then we will take that and we will kind of put it into our more formal process, which starts with, okay, great, we've identified some unmet need. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could do this? And we try very hard not to talk about the actual solution first. Our product design training is very much needs sort of first. That I believe that very strongly, that oftentimes engineers will jump to solutions and they will say, I have a solution for this problem. I really like to pick apart the problem, because I think that ultimately yields like a set of solutions, which you can then, look into, figure out, try all of them. I think if you jump to a
Yeah.
solution, you get stuck iterating one thing. So we often
Yeah.
have many solutions for a particular problem. And sometimes one person will be interested in one, someone else will be interested in something else. And then we try to very rapidly make physical things. So it could be,
Okay.
we do a lot of 3D printing these days. And so not like you're going to
Yes.
go bike packing with something like that generally, but we can make stuff that you can actually put on a bicycle to touch and feel, and, potentially ride it around in our office and things without, being too dangerous. And then we quickly go from there. So as soon as we can touch something, we're iterating on that. We may have, like I said, multiple ways we're doing something, and then it becomes more and more formal as we go. So once we've really identified, okay, it looks like we can solve this problem, and now there's a set of engineering challenges here, it then becomes an R&D project within our organization. We start to track it, somebody takes ownership over it, and then we run through sort of like what might be
Got
considered more
it.
of a normal engineering process.
Got it. Got it. And I could be wrong, but I feel like ultra cyclists, ultra riders were some of the first people that fully embrace your products, because I think there's still like some quote unquote purist cyclists out there. They're still skeptical and wouldn't change anything. Why do you think endurance riders understood the value of Redshift so quickly? And do the purist comments still bother you, or you just laugh at them now?
It's a good question. So Well, I'll answer the first part of it first. I think the reason that endurance or ultra or even even your performance gravel cyclist who's just
Yeah.
doing a ton of riding, I think the reason that those groups uh, are quick to embrace things like our products is because their mindset has always been that existing solutions may not be providing everything they need. And often, I think those groups see individuals within the group almost doing DIY solutions to things. I mean, if we think
That's
about
true.
something like
That's
tubeless
true.
tires, right? Like tubeless tires is this like group created thing that is now the standard, right? And you go back to
Yeah.
when this starts, and it's discussion boards about bringing some an interesting way of thinking about stuff from other industries. How could it work? And so I
Yeah.
think that is very much a mindset of the endurance crowd of, well, if something doesn't work, I'm going to get some tape out and I'm going to throw this thing on here and maybe I'll get some wood and something else and make something. And so I think that the sort of fixing mindset and the being prepared for anything mindset. If you take a significant trip somewhere, you're inevitably going to have problems. And so I think the person that's attracted to ultra, to bikepacking, to endurance riding is also someone who might be interested and kind of motivated by the idea that there's always a risk that something might not go well, and you need to figure it out in the moment. And that might be finding someone that can help, finding the right tool, kludging something together. So I think that mindset makes people more open to, oh wow, there's like this new product that does something that seems interesting. That might be worth trying. So I think that's probably the one of the major things. The other side of it, I think, is that, like I said before, so many of the issues that one might encounter during other types of riding are massively amplified. And so just doing a 2 day type of thing, that second day of riding, you are going to suffer everything that happened on the first day. And so I think you experience that enough times, you start to think there's something better that I could be doing. What are the areas I could focus on equipment wise? Because it may not be me. This actually may be something else. So I think there's a bit of that, like the problem becomes big enough that you are actually actively looking for solutions, as opposed to someone thinking, well, I guess this is what it's like, and I'm not going to say anything to someone else because maybe I'm the only one experiencing this or something. Um, so that, in the community aspect, may be another thing too. Once someone finds something and they share information, a lot of
Yeah.
people are interested in seeing what that's all about.
Yeah.
It's funny that the second part of your question about the comments. I feel like we get along really well with purists, and I think the reason is that I don't think we force our products as something that is required. And so I think there are, I won't necessarily say that there are brands, but I think there are trends that feel like we're being told this is how you have to do something. And I think we've
Right.
always had the mindset of, we have a product that, meets this unmet need. And if you have that need, this could be a really good thing for you to try. But if you don't have that need, that's great too. I think so. I'm guessing that the reason we don't get as much pushback on some of our stuff is because we're not pushing it as if it's the only way that someone should be doing things.
Yeah. No, I agree. Completely agree. And my only regret with Redshift is not trying sooner because it is a game changer. I love the stem. It really brings so much more comfort, which means longer time on my bike and just more enjoyable. Yeah. Yeah. And I can't wait to maybe try the other products.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. It is interesting because I think that there's this other piece to, we're talking about engineering a little bit. You have to have the follow through. I think that, there are instances, I think, where you identify this great unmet need, you find yourself a solution, but that solution, it really isn't maybe the most appropriate thing for the real world. And so I think that's this other piece that has to be there. And so, everything has to combine to do that. You have to have luck. You have to stumble upon the right things. You have to have this experience and knowledge. And so I think the stem's a good example where when we made that product actually for road cyclists. That was
Wow.
designed for road cyclists. The road cyclists are probably still one of the biggest groups of people that ride it. And this is a bit where what you see is different than what the reality is. So, there's tons and tons of people with stems on their road bikes riding around loving them, but you don't see them in pictures in magazines because it's not necessarily the thing that, someone wants to put out there, but it's all over the place. And it makes this huge difference for those riders, right? They do an extra 20 miles, they do an extra 5 miles, whatever it is. So we made that product there. Quickly, gravel became a thing. And then that was this very much more visible outlet for the products. But when we created them, we had the mindset that not like we were going to over design it, but that we needed to make sure that we brought the rigor that we had been doing with, previous work, so that there wouldn't necessarily be a predictable point at which, this would need, lots of attention. And so what's really nice is that the stem is basically maintenance free. That was our goal, but you never know if it's going to work. But now that we're almost 10 years, I think we're more than almost 10 years, maybe 11 years out, we original stems, they still don't need any maintenance, which I think is really fantastic. So that
Amazing.
is something that also I think really uh, is a big element of someone's experience with a product. You can have the best solution in the world, but then if it's just so fiddly and requires so much attention, it really detracts from the experience. And so
Yeah.
not only is there this, wow, this has a big impact on my riding, but then the idea that I never have to worry about this thing, to me, those two things are almost essential. They go
Yeah.
hand in hand. And there are products that
Absolutely.
do require a lot of attention. And I think that that can really detract from their experience.
I agree. And how about the seat post? Would you say that the seat post helps with saddle sores? And I know saddle sores, it's a combination of so many things. I have a whole episode just on saddle sore. But do you think that would help with that? Did you have that in mind as well when you designed?
I think that we did have all of that in mind, and I think that um, the rear of the bike, I'll try to just classify that as sort of one thing. It's a system, and I think that people that find the most success in terms of not getting sores, not having injuries, having a positive feeling when they're on the bike and not just constantly getting discomfort, they they do the work to also find the saddle that works for them. And so I think that, you take saddle, you take a bit of suspension, and you take bike fit, and you combine those things together. That I think is the recipe for having the sort of most success, avoiding the pitfalls that we can find with saddles. And I think it is funny because I think their saddles, in my mind, is just at the beginning of the place where we're going to actually see a lot of gains there as well. And not so much in this is reducing fatigue or anything, but actually just how does this work with my body such that I don't get physical point discomfort? And I think in my mind, that's a huge area. We think about this a lot actually, because I think that's one of the biggest turnoffs for new cyclists is
Yes.
this idea that I have to go through some sort of weird pain moment in order to come out the other end and be okay. And it's funny because I think this is a bit of the antithesis to what I said before. So I think on the surface level, that's not right in my mind. But it actually is true for many people, right? Getting a good saddle does not feel good right away. And I wish we could get ourselves to a position where that was the case, because I think new cyclists, I think it is a huge point where they drop out because they're sitting there going, this is absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
You cannot be asking me to do this to my butt. This is just not right. And everybody is different. So everyone
Yeah.
has a different version of this. Yet it is true that for many people, more riding in some duress actually leads to something positive in the end. I think that's hard to square in my mind, as a product person. I think that that's just not a good product experience at all. And I find myself a bit embarrassed to tell people that, oh yeah, it's going to really hurt you for this period of time, but it's going to get better. I mean, that's
You
a
get
very
used to it.
strange,
Yeah, it gets better.
yeah, it's a strange thing to do. So I think that's an area that is still ripe for kind of eliminating that type of issue. And not that there isn't a bit of like the body needs to get a little tougher too. I mean, that's definitely true. I think that's a big piece of this. But I think you got to combine multiple things. So you can get a suspension seat post. ours is pretty darn good, and it's going to do a lot to remove what I call the sort of like stinging moments. So not only do you get
Mm,
this fatigue, you will actually use the muscles, in your back and your butt and your legs. You'll use them less, right? Because you're going to be, more comfortable, get all this suspension benefits, right? But if you have a bad saddle, it's not going to solve that. And so
yeah.
you're going to have those things. So I think you really need to combine those things and then with the bike fit, because the bike fit is the other thing that I think has come about very strong in the last few years. I mean, when I remember the first couple times I got a more performance oriented bike, went to a bike shop. I think the bike shop was great, and they attempted to do, here's where your components should be, but it was a very sort of unsophisticated approach to things. So they did the best they could. I had no idea what it should be. I've since spent a lot of time thinking about it, and kind of learning as the industry has gotten better. But today there are so many resources where you can get a bike fit that really is
Yeah.
excellent. And I think that goes a really long way to making all this other stuff work well. So you could have a great saddle, and if you have a bad bike fit, it might not work well for you. And so I
Yeah.
think those things, they really do kind of go hand in hand. And sometimes we think about bike fit as an afterthought. I really think people should think about it as a very prominent piece of what they're doing. And if they are building a new bike, getting a new bike, or they haven't had a fit in some period of time, that bike fit could make as much a difference as upgrading anything that they do in terms of fitness, nutrition, equipment, anything, the bike fit itself. And so it feels like a lot of money sometimes, I think. But I think that is the kind of thing that, you go a year and a half, that's some of the best money that people can spend on their riding, because it pays instant dividends.
Yeah. Yeah. I tell people all the time, because some people, they are like, oh, but it's so much money. Believe me, it's the best investment you can make. And it's long lasting, like you said. You do it once, you will last for a while, unless you change something on your bike or your body, changes. But it is a great investment. But the seat post sounds amazing. I should try it.
And I think
But
that many people feel like sometimes our stem is the gateway. And I think that,
Mhm.
the experience with the stem, and I don't know if you experience this, but it's a very instant, um, pretty dramatic change.
Yes,
Very very
yes,
different than maybe other things you might do. But then you get used to it very quickly. Um,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I think that the C post is something where sometimes people will get the stem, and then all of a sudden they start really thinking about the rear of the bike,
yeah,
and they think,
yeah,
"Wow, it's really stiff back here," because
yeah,
you've changed the touch point up front pretty significantly. And then when they add the C post, I think that oftentimes it's kind
exactly.
of this combination that all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, now I'm getting a similar kind of benefit here. So yeah, it is funny how sometimes one thing can really kind of focus you in on something else.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You got me. And you're talking about the saddle, that we are at the tip of the iceberg with the saddle, which brings me to my next question. How do you think bikes and bike tech will change over the next 10 years?
It's a great question. I mean, obviously, it's something that I'm often thinking about. So the Sea Otter Classic in California was a few weeks ago now. It's becoming a pretty great event. It has been now for a number of years, where most of the industry is kind of descending on one location, and that makes for a pretty exciting kind of moment of sharing, and sort of in-person collaboration. This year, there was a few dramatic things that were happening there. It's kind of a bellwether of like what is a new tech trend, for instance. And I think probably the thing that was the biggest takeaway for most people was there is going to be a pretty dramatic change in the economics of bikes going forward. And so I think a lot of people came out of that thinking, oh, 32, tires, this is going to be this interesting trend. And I think that's innovation, and that's people pushing boundaries and trying to find things. But actually, the underlying takeaway that I think people should be paying attention to is we are at the moment in time, which is just the beginning of very serious brands coming out of China with very performance oriented equipment that is made in the exact same factory where all of the performance bikes, from some of these big brands are being done. And this is what I mentioned earlier. There's a bit of a change. Taiwan was the center of the universe for bikes for so long. And I think that those Taiwanese factories had slowly started arms in China. But now I think we are seeing, and it was a very dramatic kind of moment in time at this event because one of the brands unveiled, sort of a complete line of bikes with a price point that was, pretty earth shattering. And so I think that that's just the beginning of some pretty big changes in terms of the sort of customer expectations for high performance and price point. And so, as a brand that, we operate sort of in this mode of we have premium products that, we don't apologize for the cost of them because of what we're delivering with them, right? You can always find a cheap alternative to something. And I think, customers and I think people in general have a pretty good sense of, is something cheap the thing that is going to work for me, or do I want to get something that's going to last, that, that's been proven, et cetera. And so I think that, that's always true for all kinds of stuff. But I think this moment in time now is sort of a signal that all of the ways that some of these brands coming out of China are going to be able to challenge the existing price points. I think that's a big, it will be a change in people's minds, where will these brands go to the forefront and people will start to associate them with the highest quality equipment? And will that force a change across the board in terms of how, things are priced and how value is thought about? So I think that's probably that's not a great answer to your question, like, oh, there's going to be this thing. But I think that will be an underlying disruption for so many.
Yeah, it's a disruption. Yeah, it's a big change. It's the future. Yeah, yeah. I have a quick fire round now. Okay. Is that okay? Yeah. All right. Gravel or road?
Gravel for me, yeah.
Suspension stem or seat post?
Suspension stem.
Most overhyped cycling trend?
Oh, that's tough. I mean, there's a lot of those. That's a really difficult one. Honestly, I think the recent example is this 32-inch trend. I think it's incredibly overhyped, and almost as if there was some kind of secret meeting where everyone said they were going to do this crazy thing.
Yes.
So to me, that's got to be the most recent example.
Titanium, carbon, or steel?
I would go with carbon. I actually really like carbon bikes myself. So
Aero socks, genius or ridiculous?
Oh, I'm all about getting gains wherever I can get them. So as long as I feel cool in them, I'd be happy to wear it. Yeah.
Agree. What's worse, numb hands or saddle sores?
I think numb hands, because it's an indication of something going on that could affect you long term.
Yeah. One cycling myth engineers hate hearing.
Well, that's a great question. I wish I had like the perfect. There's so many, that come up. But I think the one we've been talking about is the one that I think comes up for me. The idea that speed or performance and comfort are somehow, not, they're at opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. Well, Erik, I think what's really interesting about Redshift is not that you're just building components, but you are quietly changing the culture around cycling and bikes. I'm so excited. I'm pumped with this episode. I'm sure a lot of people are going to have a lot of takeaways from this. Thank you so much for coming to Zone to Speak. It's been really a pleasure.
Thank you for having us. It's a great conversation. I love talking about this stuff. So yeah, very much appreciated.
Awesome. I hope you can come back sometime soon, because I think there's so much more I want to unpack here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's all for today's episode. I want to thank the listeners for tuning in. Your support means everything. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider following, leaving a review, and sharing it with your friends.